Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today is about authenticity in politicians and how much does that matter in elections. Politicians are generally considered untrustworthy, sleazy, underhanded, slimy, backstabbing, dirty, treacherous, dishonest, devious, and whatever other negative description you want to use to describe them as. Now, whether that's true or not, or regardless of how true that is, when we perceive a politician as authentic, it's like a breath of fresh air to us. Maybe even a sigh of relief. We've found one of the good ones. Authenticity is all the rage in evaluating government officials and candidates for elected office, and it's often used to describe much of why a politician is so effective at generating support. This candidate won because their voters perceived that they were super authentic. And yeah, that's all well and good. But what exactly is an authentic politician? Because if you peer below the surface level commentary just a bit, you'll find what makes an authentic politician isn't exactly straightforward, even if we like to think it is. So what exactly is authenticity, and how do we measure it? How do our biases color our perception of somebody's authenticity? How much do people value authenticity? And how much should we value it? These questions make for very important discussions about how we evaluate candidates and government officials and what elections should be about. So let's explore authenticity and get a better sense of the answers to these questions. And I think first off, it makes sense to talk about how do we define authenticity? Well, if we just want to look at the plain dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster's definition of authenticity is the quality of being authentic. Okay, that's the unhelpful definition. Don't you hate it when dictionaries give you the unhelpful definitions? The act of or the quality of being, don't even bother putting that definition. Stupid, wasting time. Anyways, the actual helpful definition from Merriam-Webster of what authenticity is that it's the quality of being authoritative, valid, true, real, or genuine. Okay, that's all well and good. But is that how authenticity is defined in political contexts? Because the problem is authenticity is one of those many words that we just take for granted as self-explanatory, but it's not as straightforward as we like to think, because we all have our specific people that we support, and we oftentimes think them as, oh yes, that person is very authentic. But then somebody else is going to look at them and like, are you kidding me? That person's the least authentic person I've ever seen. Whether we realize it or not, we have different definitions of what an authentic candidate is. And even if you look at the dictionary definition, that may not include some aspect that we would argue is authentic. Authentic can also mean integrity, which generally means consistency with one's principles. And that was not in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So what are some potential meanings people have when they are looking for an authentic candidate? And I'm going to list a few of these and some of the strengths and weaknesses to each of these in terms of whether these make sense as a definition for authentic. So, first one, we just said it, consistency. So, authentic candidates are seen as consistent. They stick to their guns. They're keeping integrity. They're voting and supporting on issues in a similar manner repeatedly. They're voting in a way that you would expect them to vote. So that makes sense. We want to support somebody who is consistent on what they believe. We want to be able to get a sense of what somebody believes in. We want them to get, and especially if we vote for them because they have similar views to us, we want them to continue to adhere to those views and not just change on a whim, especially because some people may say, oh, they're changing on a whim because it's politically expedient. And sometimes that's true. So authentic, meaning consistency, makes a lot of sense. However, people can also genuinely change. They can be moved by opposing arguments. maybe that opposing arguments show them a side of an issue that they never thought about before, and it really convinces them to say, you know what, I'm actually going to vote differently on this issue in this particular instance. You also have to make deals when you're in office to get laws passed. Even if you're the same party, sometimes you'll see intra-party squabbles, both for Republicans and Democrats, about what a policy should encompass, or the specific language of a bill, or just the general overall strategy of what a party should be in a given election. But people can genuinely change, and not because it's politically expedient. And theoretically, we like people who are open to other viewpoints. Now, the most partisan and ideological people don't like that. They just want them to stay in their boxes. But if somebody genuinely changes their mind on a particular issue, does that mean that suddenly that's a lack of consistency and therefore it's inauthentic? What if it was just one time they did it, but that one time incensed a group so badly that they wanted to get that person out of office? They put up another candidate to primary them. If candidate, and let's take if you take the redistricting issues going on right now in Indiana. Several Indiana state legislators lost their primary because they did not go along with redistricting, and they got primaried largely because of that. Now, they might have been consistent on everything else. They might have towed the party line in every other instance. I don't know their specific voting histories off the top of my head, but they may have otherwise been stalwarts of the party. But just that one time was a perception of inconsistency, and I will assume that a lot of voters perceived those candidates as inauthentic because they went against the party. And we'll talk more about those, how authenticity is colored by those partisan biases shortly. But another way we can look at authenticity is how truthful somebody is. And I think this is probably the most common meaning that people mean behind authentic. An authentic person is seen as truthful, that they're honest, that they tell you what they really think. They tell you what's really on their mind. Because that makes sense. Authenticity is often synonymous with telling the truth about who you are and what you believe. And generally speaking, we're going to, even if somebody doesn't like another candidate or doesn't like a particular candidate, if they're staying true to themselves, or at least they're perceived to stay true to themselves, somebody may still agree that that person is authentic. But on the flip side, it's not just about being honest about what you believe. Sometimes people see authentic as, are you telling the truth about facts or issues? So that makes sense. However, many times it turns out that truthfulness is but a facade. Countless politicians, once seen as authentic or truthful, suddenly get caught in a lie, and it might be a massive lie. Maybe it's a small lie. Maybe it's multiple small lies over a period of time. But even many truthful people lie at some point. Now, of course, that doesn't justify lying, but if somebody does it just one time, does that mean that they're no longer authentic? How often does somebody have to lie, and how big do those lies have to be to no longer be authentic? Or what if it's not necessarily a lie, but they weasel their way out of something where they're like, oh, no, I actually said blah, 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 and it's technically not going back on their word, but they said it in a way where they can sort of hedge their bets. That can also often be seen as more inauthentic than simply just saying, yeah, I changed my mind, or I was wrong about this, or yes, I lied about this. Sorry. Obviously, that can take a serious hit to somebody's authenticity and credibility. Or how about another definition for authenticity as relatability? We tend to perceive authentic people as more relatable to us, that they understand our problems, that they're going to advocate for us, or the people that we can relate to are inherently more authentic. So if we are working class and we encounter a working class candidate, or a candidate shares our demographics like whether they're a man or a woman, whatever their race is, whatever. Take your pick about what demographic, what industry they work in. Sometimes that can work hand in hand with approachability. When we see somebody that is relatable to us in some sort of demographic fashion, or their viewpoints we find relatable, we may see those people as inherently more approachable, more inherently relatable, and therefore we'll see them as more authentic. And that makes sense. If we trust somebody, we tend to find them more relatable, and we tend to trust people more if we find them relatable in the first place. So it's kind of, relatability can lead to more trust. It can lead to more perception of authenticity, or we trust somebody and then find them more relatable, which then feeds into the perception of authenticity. It can work a couple different ways. And of course, we don't want to think that somebody who is inauthentic is like us, right? Unless you're somebody who really does not care. You have like no moral scruples whatsoever. You hope people think you're authentic, but you don't personally care if you're authentic. Beyond that, though, most people generally want to see themselves as authentic people. And if we see some of ourselves in somebody who's inauthentic, that comes back and hurts our egos. So we're going to tend to think that somebody who's similar to us in some way, somebody that we can relate to, is going to be more authentic. Again, makes sense. However, relatability can encompass a whole variety of characteristics. So once again, all those demographics that we talk about, they can be relatable in one aspect, but not relatable in another. And often that relatability is still used as a political ploy and a tool so that someone can get themselves into a position of power. They tell you about, you hear a lot from people who call themselves outsiders. The funny thing about outsider candidates is that eventually they become the insider. And once you run for office and once you win, you can no longer call yourself an outsider, even though some people like to call themselves outsiders. Yeah, you may not be part of the quote unquote establishment, but you're not an outsider, not anymore. That whole outsider shtick kind of becomes hollow, although it works for some people. But just because somebody is similar to you in many respects, does that make them authentic? We're seeing a reflection of ourselves in that person. So we're tending to think that they are authentic because of that. But if we really think about it, is that person really an authentic person just because they're similar to us? Can we dissociate ourselves enough from the fact that that person is similar to us in certain respects, like politically or demographically? A lot of times we can't, because we tend to think of it as a reflection on our groups that we associate with. And that's a serious problem for political discourse, but that's a little bit of a different discussion. But lastly, one other way that authenticity can be defined, and most people won't actually define it this way, but in reality, deep down, this is what some people mean. And it happens to all of us. Authenticity sometimes really just means that we agree with what that person says. We tend to perceive people that share many of our opinions as authentic. I mean, just look at memes, for example. Who doesn't enjoy a good meme? But a lot of those memes are sort of not microcosms, but they are representative of those opinions. We see, if we laugh at a meme about politics or whatever, it tends to be because we share that opinion. If we don't share that opinion, a lot of times we tend to not find it funny. But once again, kind of goes back to relatability. These people think like us, then they have to be authentic people, right? People who think like us have to have positive traits just like us, right? And authenticity is a positive trait. Yes, that makes sense. Because people who think like us, you're going to want to think that they're positive people. And being in agreement makes us more likely to see this person as these other definitions of authenticity too. So if we agree with these people, we may also see them as more consistent, more truthful, more relatable, having more integrity, and so on. However, being in agreement on issues also activates our biases and predispositions. Obviously, we're talking about confirmation bias here. So, of course, we're going to be incentivized to see these people as more authentic and also more likely to dismiss contrary evidence. No. This person actually is really authentic because blah, blah, blah. This other stuff doesn't matter. And it tends to not matter if your political views are being pandered to or your political interests are becoming reality because of the party in power happening to be yours, and they support policies that you support. But can you agree with somebody while still thinking they are inauthentic? Can you look at somebody and be like, boy, that guy's a weasel, but I do like some of the things that he stands for? Can you do that? Some people can. Can you disagree with somebody while still thinking they are authentic, trustworthy, consistent, relatable? Because you see more and more people can't just disagree on stuff. It has to be an existential crisis. And it's not just, oh, this person, I don't think they see things correctly. It has to be, this person is stupid, evil, terrible. They're going to destroy this country. Everything is going to go wrong if they get back in power or if they stay in power or get in power. So we should be able to, and of course, that doesn't mean that somebody you disagree with is automatically authentic, but you should be able to disagree with somebody and still be able to see, at least in some cases, them being as authentic. And some people will say, oh, yeah, of course, I believe that. I don't just treat people differently based on their political views, although, is that actually true? In any case, though, our biases do influence us to not feel this way about individual people we disagree with. And this subjectivity of authenticity can be problematic for trying to study it from a scientific point of view. And when it is studied from a scientific point of view, it's probably most studied from the perspective of citizens, because after all, the idea is that voters' perception of a candidate's authenticity influences who that voter chooses at the ballot box. It's about how authentic that candidate appears to those voters. But other measurements have tried to take other ways of, or other perspectives into account, like a candidate's self-presentation, what some people would call performed political authenticity. So does this person talk like you would expect an authentic person to talk, or do they dress a certain way that exudes an authentic vibe? Is this person attractive? That, as much as we don't want to admit it, how attractive we think a candidate is can influence our opinion. More on that shortly. But you can also look at it through media depictions as well, what some people would call mediated political authenticity. So how are these various political outlets painting this person? Are they talking about this person's inconsistencies? Do these outlets flat out say this person is untruthful? There's a lot of biased outlets out there. Do these outlets focus on how relatable they are? Or do they say, like, has this person fulfilled all their promises from when they got elected? That sort of thing. And so the scientific study of authenticity is a burgeoning field, but it's arguably relatively new. I'd say the vast majority of scientific study has been over the past couple decades or so. Now, there might be some roots to it in even earlier decades, but this really honing in on authenticity is probably about 25 years. But one study I will cite comes from Simon Lubke and Ines Engelman in the Public Library of Sciences, actually just a couple of years ago. They cite a lot of previous studies on authenticity in an attempt to craft their own political authenticity scale. And sources they cite used measurements such as the self-presentation of the candidate in social media, the candidate's portrayal by newspapers, the difference between the public persona and the private persona, how that was measured before, a politician's quote unquote realness, and so on. All sorts of factors and measurements that they used, or that previous studies have used to measure authenticity. And so in this article that I'm citing here, Lubke and Engelman came up with this idea of 4 dimensions of political authenticity based on the existing research. 1 was consistency, 2 was intimacy, 3 was ordinariness, and 4 was immediacy. So consistency refers to politicians acting consistently and according to expectations based on prior experiences. Now, whether it's that citizen had prior experiences with that politician, maybe they went to that politician's rally, maybe they've sent letters to that congressperson's office, maybe they've called the office, or they've talked to their staff. Maybe that citizen has a view of their consistency based on that candidate's or that office holder's party or ideology, or just politicians in general. At the very top of the episode, talked about how politicians are often seen as conniving and devious and dubious. So that often will just paint somebody's view of politicians in general as inauthentic. Then you have intimacy. So citizens, that refers to when citizens believe they know politicians' true characters and personalities behind the public figures, because there can be pretty much everybody has at least some level of difference between their public persona and their private persona. But how big is that gap? It's not necessarily that one is completely different from the other. It's just that one might mask some of the personality traits that you normally would show to people that you know very well. Those get masked when you talk to people in the public. And we all do that to some extent, or at least most of us do that to some extent. So intimacy also being how open you are to others by sharing private thoughts and views and life details. When we see more and more behind the curtain of somebody, or at least what we think is behind the curtain, because some people can, when especially on social media in general, not just politicians, but they look at all the good stuff that's happening on social media, but they rarely talk about all the bad things that are going on in their lives, all the negative aspects, unless maybe it's a way they can use it to try to score some political brownie points. Sometimes that happens too, but that's a little bit cynical, but it does happen. But in any case, intimacy, this openness to sharing your private thoughts, views, life details, or at least what people perceive to be sharing of private details, that can also make somebody perceive a politician to be more authentic. Ordinariness. Politicians appear as ordinary people. They are close to the people from our communities and daily lives, similar to that relatability aspect we just mentioned earlier. So they seem down to earth, and they might have minor flaws and show moments of imperfection, but then that can also make them feel more authentic. Now, don't show too big of flaws, because then people will turn on you. More minor flaws, obviously that's relative, because what's minor to some people may be a big deal to other people. So it's hard to come up with an objective way to measure that. And then lastly, immediacy. So directly revealing your true selves to the public, not seeming strategic, but driven by true convictions and emotions. And to some extent, that sounds a little bit like intimacy, but you also appear spontaneous and say what you think, regardless of the consequences. Like when somebody talks about how politically incorrect they are, sometimes those people are considered more authentic. So the immediacy is that, oh, you're not just revealing your true thoughts, you're just immediately saying what's on your mind. You're not saying it in a metered way. You are just outright saying, this is what I think. So those are other valid ways to look at the issue, if you will, of authenticity. But problem is, with all these different criteria for what makes somebody authentic, there also isn't always agreement on who is authentic. Because obviously authenticity is seen as a positive trait, and we tend to not want to ascribe positive traits to people we don't like or that we disagree with. So would you, person who is listening to this or watching this, would you say Donald Trump is authentic? Would you say Barack Obama is authentic? Is your state's governor authentic? Like, is it my state is Florida, so Ron DeSantis. Or are you in California with Gavin Newsom, Illinois with J.B. Pritzker, and Texas with Greg Abbott, or the other 46 governors in the United States? Are they authentic? Is your local congressperson authentic? Whether it's your U.S. House representative or one of your U.S. senators, are your state legislators authentic? If you ask two different people from your same area, maybe it's your neighbor, about whether that person's authentic, you might get two very different answers there. And you might really think that your view of whether a candidate or an office holder is authentic is factual. I mean, you may be strongly convicted. I've been there too. I felt very strongly convicted about an opinion of mine. Everybody has. Just some people do it a lot more often than others and are not willing to admit that it's subjective. But how much is your perception of that politician's authenticity colored by your biases? Now, party is the most obvious one, but what about those demographic similarities that we brought up? Or maybe you personally know the person, especially if they're local enough. Other various traits that can be used to activate biases. We're more likely to perceive somebody as more authentic if we share the same party, ideology, issue stances, political group affiliations, etc. And it is a very subjective term, but any attempts to be at least objective about it kind of go by the wayside because our biases are heavily influencing us to feel one way or another. But there are other things that can influence our view of a politician's authenticity that aren't necessarily partial from a partisan or ideological view, or at least they're not totally a matter of partisan or ideological views. We just mentioned a couple of those earlier. News media reports can take the role of quote unquote authenticating agents who evaluate politicians' performances and authenticity claims. Now, of course, many of these outlets also have their own partisan or ideological leanings, and we will seek them out in large part because of that reason. So if you're Republican and or conservative, probably going to go to something like Fox News or One American Network. If you're liberal or Democrat, you're probably going to go to something like CNN or MSNBC. There's also the fact that candidates with a lot more backing from their community and advocacy groups, they can seem more authentic because they're more, quote unquote, verified by more groups. That's why candidates try hard to get endorsements, especially from the really biggest groups, like how a lot of Republicans try to get small businesses or small business owners or trade associations to support them, or how Democrats try to get a lot of labor union leaders to support them. It acts as a sort of like social media, almost like that blue check mark you see on Twitter. It's kind of like that in an election context and trying to generate support. When you see more public faces backing a specific candidate, you see more endorsements. A lot of people will see them as more authentic, especially if we already have a predisposition towards those groups that are, or those specific people that are endorsing that candidate. So if we're very pro-labor, very pro-business, and we see those relevant groups accordingly endorsing somebody, it acts as sort of like a mental shortcut where if we're having trouble deciding between candidates and we see these groups that we trust endorsing these candidates, we'll say, oh, okay, that person, that one is an authentic person. I'm going to go ahead and vote for that person because this group I like would not support somebody who's not authentic. Or how about how viral information can become, which unfortunately is part of what makes misinformation and disinformation so potent, because it's getting circulated by so many people. And even though we may intuitively know that that doesn't necessarily make it true, that just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. How many times have we seen something that we were predisposed to agree with and a whole bunch of people shared it and you're like, whoa, wait, what? that person said that? Oh, that thing is true? And then later on, it turns out to not be true. We've all got before. But when you see that, and depending on how positive or negative it is towards a candidate, that will influence our views of that candidate's authenticity, especially if that viral information is focused on this person went against what they said before, or see this person do this really one great thing in the community. They're just like us. Or how about the appearance and or attractiveness of candidates? That can make us assume that somebody is more authentic, as well as other positive traits like, oh, this person knows what they're doing. It happens, and it doesn't necessarily completely sway our opinion about a given candidate or a given race, but all of us have seen somebody run for office that we thought was attractive, and we stopped for a moment and thought, oh, you know what? I'm really interested in what this person has to say. It happens. It's about being self-aware about that and not letting it completely cloud your opinion. And then lastly, but this is not a comprehensive list, but another thing that can influence how we perceive somebody's authenticity that is not inherently partisan or ideological is economic context. Because if the economy is in the dumps, more voters, especially those who are more retrospective in their voting, they're more likely to think the party in power is not only responsible, but that they are less authentic, that they're inauthentic. Partly because they'll think something like, how can an authentic person do this? How could they let this happen? If they were really authentic, they wouldn't do that. Or probably more likely because that party or person that's being blamed for the economic issue is trying to find ways to not accept blame. Whether they really are to blame or not, that's not the point. But the fact that they're evading blame for economic issues is going to lead a lot of people to say, oh, that person's full of it. They're not an authentic person. I can't vote for them, even if they voted for them before. You hear people talk about how much they regret voting for somebody in a previous election. Now, we've talked a lot about how authenticity can be very subjective, but in any case, regardless of how we define it, how much do we actually look for authenticity in our candidates and elected officials or even appointed officials? Because authenticity has become a more common buzzword in recent decades, but how much do people really care about it? It is true that authenticity has some impact on vote choice, but who is it a major driver for? I mean, there's probably nobody that actually wants a lack of authenticity. Just about everybody, I think, wants their candidates to be authentic, but it doesn't mean that it's a high priority for a lot of voters. Once again, some people can think that a candidate is right for the job, but they don't necessarily think that they're authentic. They might think they're a little sleazy, but they say, you know what, I think this person has a good track record in office. I'm going to have to vote for them. Could be all sorts of reasons, but survey research sometimes misses this info of how strongly someone prioritizes a view on a political issue or a character trait or whatever the case is. They just simply measure people's views. And sometimes they'll say, like, do you strongly agree with this? Do you strongly disagree with this? And that might be a very short-term thing. Maybe they strongly support the war in Iran right now. Does that necessarily mean that they are going to hold that strength of support later? Or if they could really strongly support it, but it's still not that important of an issue to them in the grand scheme of things. Because you could really support something, but it doesn't necessarily impact you directly, or at least you don't feel like it impacts you directly. Talk about the Iran war. I remember back in grad school, a book that really took 8 chapters to say basically the same exact thing. But what it was about was a pollster who was working in the business during when the U.S. was going to invade Iraq. And a lot of polls had found that there was a lot of support for going to Iraq, but I'm trying to remember the details, but I believe that basically a lot of the information about how strongly somebody really felt about it. Like they strongly agreed that we needed to go to Iraq, but if the government didn't do it, people didn't really care as much about that. It's something along those lines. But even if you think you're really measuring how much somebody strongly cares about something, you might not actually be getting that. Somebody can strongly agree with something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they actively care about that problem. And also, somebody could just say that they care about that problem, but they, in reality, really don't. If push came to shove, their actions would show maybe they don't actually care as much as they think they do. But how about some more specific mathematical data on this about how much people value authenticity in our candidates and officials? So I can point you to one particular survey from late 2024 that sheds some light on such preferences. And it comes from American University's Sine Institute of Policy and Politics. And it said that out of 1,200 Americans sampled ages 18 to 34, 47% valued authenticity and 51% valued integrity, which sometimes gets used interchangeably with authenticity. And there's been a bunch of studies that I've been told about and heard about over, however many years now, that say that young people or particularly my generation, millennials, and the generation after me, Gen Z, have this particular focus on somebody's authenticity. There's been a lot about like how specifically millennials and Gen Z care about authenticity. And not just in the context of politics, but when it comes to social media influencers and actors and athletes and so on, how much we see those people as authentic is a really core focus of a lot of these studies. And this extra focus by academic studies on the desire for authenticity from younger people like myself is kind of, I don't know the word to describe it as, but it feels kind of odd to some degree because it almost acts as if like this is something new, almost as if it's only younger people that really want authenticity. It might be more desired now than in previous generations, but it's not like previous generations didn't want somebody authentic or didn't care about authenticity. It just wasn't as well studied back then. So it's just kind of odd that it feels like it's being talked about as if it's a new trend. And also, all this focus on authenticity often misses a key aspect. And part of the problem is because perception of authenticity is largely subjective. And this aspect is how good, or in a lot of cases, bad, we are at assessing a candidate's authenticity. Regardless of whether we are Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, Baby Boomer, doesn't really matter what generation you are. We can be extraordinarily bad at assessing authenticity. But it's also, again, very hard to quantify how bad we are at doing that because authenticity can be very subjective. Even if we come up with these concrete definitions of how to measure authenticity, somebody can go back and say, I don't think that's really a good way to measure that aspect of authenticity. This is actually how you should do it. And for myself, I'll admit I've had more than a few occasions, both in my personal life and in my political assessments, where I really thought somebody was authentic, that they were truthful, relatable. I really thought this person was a great candidate or a great office holder. And then they gave me some sort of reason. Sometimes it was objective, where they objectively lied about something, or they were objectively a jerk, or it might have been a subjective reason where they just said something in a way that I really didn't like, or I thought that their reason for voting a certain way was awful. As much as I try to not let my biases color my perceptions, I'm a human too. It happens to me as well. I try to be as self-aware of it as I can, but in any case, I've been quite bad at assessing authenticity. Or somebody could have been really authentic at that specific point in time, and then later on, just something happens and they're suddenly not authentic anymore. And that might be objective or subjective. But in any case, all of us can be very, very bad at assessing authenticity because we don't ultimately. Authenticity is about what we perceive somebody to truly be. And for a lot of people, you really can't know what they're truly like. They might show it off a little bit at some points, but our biases can still very much influence that perception of authenticity or how what we that little bit of private detail that they show, whether it's a private moment of weakness, our biases can still influence us to believe, I knew that was how that person was. I knew they were a terrible, horrible person, that they sucked. Or if you're more predisposed to think they're authentic, you might say, oh, but that was one moment of weakness. That is not, we should not judge people on that one moment of weakness. Which one of those sides is accurate? That's can oftentimes be very hard to say. But it's one thing to perceive somebody as authentic, but are we able to in any way measure how accurately we assess somebody's authenticity? To some extent, you might be able to, but there is also still going to be plenty of subjectivity and bias to even doing that. But I think it is reasonable to say that we're not all that great at trying to figure out if somebody is being true to themselves, at least not all the time. And there's also the fact that we can say we value authenticity, and we might really believe that we value authenticity, but yet we don't really support it as much as we think. When push comes to shove, maybe at some point, authenticity doesn't become important to us. Maybe we say that we really support authenticity, and this one candidate we thought was really authentic, they do something that we really support, but then they show a different side of them that seems to be very inauthentic, but because their stance or action on a specific issue, whatever they did, was something we really agreed with, suddenly we might not care as much about authenticity. So sometimes our biases still lead us to perceive authenticity or a lack thereof instead of trying to independently assess it ourselves. Which brings us to this last point. There's one thing about how to define authenticity, and then it's another to say how much we do value it and how well we assess it. But how should we value authenticity? Now, I think it's safe to say, obviously, generally, it's a good thing to have. We generally should be authentic in our dealings. We should want our elected officials to be authentic. It's an important trait to have. But the problem is it partly depends on our definition of authenticity, whether it's based on consistency, relatability, truthfulness, integrity, immediacy, willingness to show private details, integrity, or I already said integrity, take your pick. But if a candidate goes against one or more of these definitions, does that make them inauthentic? So if somebody is, consistently pro whatever, and they suddenly one day vote differently, they might have been inconsistent. But what if they were really truthful about why they changed their vote at that time? They said, look, I know I normally support, I'm normally against gun control, for example. But this one particular situation I was really swayed by this opposing argument. And I think this one particular instance, this one particular law is a reasonable law. Let's just use that as an example. So technically they were inconsistent because they went against their typical voting pattern. But what if that was really the truth about why they went against that voting pattern? But then they also only did it once. So does that mean that they're not consistent? But what if that is inconsistent, but they were still being truthful? And maybe they were willing to show you their private musings and mullings over why they were going to vote a different way on that issue. So they may fit one definition of authenticity, but not another. So does that mean that they're inauthentic? Is authenticity a binary measurement? Is it simply this person is authentic, this person's not authentic? Is there some sort of scale like 5 points, 10 points, 100 points that says how authentic somebody is? In any case, even if we were to objectively measure authenticity and objectively be able to say this person is authentic, that still doesn't make them a good candidate. You still need some skills and knowledge about how the political process works. You still need to be able to work with other people. You still need a little bit of luck on your side. You still need to be able to raise funds. You still need to be able to do all sorts of things, communicate with voters, be able to run your office efficiently and find the right staff to help run your office efficiently. You have to be accessible. If you're not any of those things, or you're woefully inadequate on some of those things, but you're an authentic candidate, does that mean you should be voted for? Not to mention, all of our predispositions based on what that candidate thinks about various political issues. But just because somebody's authentic doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good candidate. And at the end of the day, we might want to be careful that we don't become too wrapped up in how authentic somebody is. Yes, it's a great trait to have. Yes, it's something that we should value, but we should be careful about how much we value it. Because somebody not being authentic doesn't automatically mean that they're good at the job. And just because somebody's not authentic doesn't mean that they're bad at the job that they're running for, or that they were already elected to do so. And so I think the two biggest points to end off on are careful just how much we value authenticity, and really think about what we actually mean by authenticity. Because a lot of times we think somebody is authentic based on our biases. We don't actually try to independently assess somebody's authenticity. And biases are going to creep in because we're human beings, and that's just how it is. But actually being self-aware about those biases and trying to step outside of those and really think about, okay, do I really believe this person's authentic, or is it just because I tend to agree with their views on something? Do I really believe this other person is inauthentic, or is it just because I don't agree with what they believe? I think it's something that we need to ask ourselves a lot more. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. My links to the show notes, my Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn profile, medium.com profile, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization in American politics, my book on Amazon, my website, paulrader.org, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. And that's going to end things today. So as always, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.